I ended up moving to the Barrie area, and then went out west for fashion school, and then came back to Bobcaygeon, and now I'm in the Durham region, which I've been here for about 5 years now, maybe going on 6. I have a husband named Mike and a son named Lyndon. If you follow along on our social media, you've probably seen pictures of them before. An interesting fact about me is that I've hiked the Camino in Europe twice. It's a pilgrimage, and combined, the 2 routes are about 1,400 kilometers. So each time I went, it took about a month of straight hiking to get to the end. So that's one of my proudest accomplishments, I think, is just getting through those 2 long hikes. And I live a zero waste lifestyle at home. So that means something different to everyone. There is no way to really live 100% zero waste, but you can do a pretty good, amount of waste reduction on an individual level. And we try our best in our household to reduce our waste as best we can. And we're always looking for new ways to do that and to produce less and less garbage. So A Greener Future is the nonprofit that I started in 2014. It all started with me picking up a few pieces of garbage in my community, and I realized that one litter cleanup was definitely not enough. So I continued on my journey, and eventually people wanted to join me, and eventually I got sponsors. So I turned A Greener Future into an official nonprofit in November 2014. Since then, we've developed 2 main programs. So Love Your Lake is our biggest one. That's where we do 100 litter cleanups along the shores of Lake Ontario. And the Butt Blitz is our second biggest one. So that one consists of litter cleanups all along that one consists of cigarette butt cleanups all across Canada. So both programs, this would have been our 5th year for Love Your Lake and 6th year for the Butt Blitz. We did have to change our schedule a little bit because of the current circumstances, but we're making it work anyways. So to date, we've picked up over 1.4 million pieces of litter. We're getting really close to 1.5 million, and hopefully we get there in the next few months. We have about 500 volunteers that join us annually. So that's at our litter cleanups. For the most part, usually Love Your Lake, but also through our Butt Blitz event too. And we have 2 full-time staff. One's me, and the other one's Chelsea, who is our communications coordinator. So she does things like updating the website, running our social media, and coming up with content and ways to engage our viewers and our volunteers and that kind of thing. We also have about 5 interns on average at any point in the year. And our interns do things like write blog posts, analyze data. They come to cleanups when we have them going on, and just do things like brainstorming and helping us kind of like keep everything together and make A Greener Future fun and exciting. So, hold on a second here. So now we'll talk a little bit about Lake Ontario. So I bet a few of you have actually been to Lake Ontario. I actually don't have a lot of memories going to it when I was younger, but especially when I moved to the Durham region, I went to Lake Ontario a lot more often. Lake Ontario it's pretty big. It's about 500 kilometers long from end to end. And there's a lot of different ecosystems and wildlife along the route. We get to see that when we're out doing our litter cleanups each year, which is a lot of fun. And it's amazing because you can go from somewhere like the Scarborough Bluffs, where there's like massive cliffs, to Sandbanks Provincial Park, where there's massive dunes. So you get to see a little bit of everything. It's also drinking water for 9 million people. So a lot of people don't really realize that. that their drinking water possibly comes straight out of Lake Ontario, which is a really big reason why we want to protect Lake Ontario and keep it clean. It's also a place to swim. There's lots of recreation on Lake Ontario, including fishing and boating, and there's actually a lot of science and research that's going on in the lake as well. So this is a picture of Lake Ontario, and it shows all of the places that we did litter cleanups last summer during our Love Your Lake program. So all of the markers are public events, and the dots are private events. So either events that we did cleanups with like Girl Guides or a private company, or with our own team, or sometimes we have sponsors that come out with us. So last year, Honda was one of our main sponsors, and they came out to 3 events and send their employees as volunteers. So Lake Ontario is obviously part of the Great Lakes, and a lot of people don't realize the flow of the Great Lakes. Lake Ontario is actually the last stop before the ocean. So the water and the garbage that ends up in Lake Ontario flows out through the St. Lawrence River and ends up in the ocean. So that's why it's more important than anything to get that garbage out of the lake and away from the lake before it has a chance to get out into the ocean. So Lake Ontario is actually the most populated lake as well. There's more people surrounding Lake Ontario, which means there's a lot more garbage that can end up in the lake too. So we're going to talk a little bit about the data that we collect while we're doing our cleanups. So this is a graph of the breakdown of all the litter that we collect. But because we run the butt blitz, we pick up a lot more cigarette butts than anything else. So when we put this into a graph, it actually skews quite a bit, and you can't really see the composition of anything else. So we also make a graph that shows all the litter except for the cigarette butts, because there's just so many of them that it offsets everything else. So you can see on this graph that the thing we pick up most of is plastic pieces. So the plastic pieces come in many forms, and usually it means that we don't know what it is. So if it is identifiable as a bottle cap, or you know, like some sort of like Tim Hortons cup lid or anything like that, we have a category for that. But if it's a piece of plastic that we can't identify as something specific, it goes into that category. The second biggest is foam. So that's, a lot of people will call it styrofoam. It's a type of plastic, and we do find a lot of it because it floats very easily and ends up on the shoreline. And then the third is food wrappers. So that's anything from like granola bar wrappers to, we found a lot of like mostly fast food, but it's usually single-use packaging. A lot of it is plastic, especially like things like saran wrap, and even just like things like Dunkaroos and fruit roll-ups and all that processed food type stuff. So out of all of the litter that we've picked up, remember we're close to 1.5 million pieces. What would you guys estimate the percentage of plastic is? Write it in the comments, and we'll see if anyone can guess. We're looking for a percent. So, okay. So somewhere between 60 and we have 95. Okay. So the actual total of plastic is 96%. You're close, Lindsay. So yeah, it's crazy. Almost everything we pick up is plastic. And part of the reasoning for that is that if it's metal, it's most likely to sink to the bottom. If it's paper, it's probably going to disintegrate a lot faster. than other things, and we might not ever see it. If it's wood, we don't usually pick it up unless it's something like a piece of construction with nails in it or something like that. Yeah, so the only thing that's really left over is plastic, and it doesn't degrade, so it just sticks around until we pick it up. So there's a lot, which means that there's a lot to tackle because we're using plastic every day in our everyday lives. So there's a lot of work to do to get this number a lot lower. So let's talk about some of the problem items. So when we do a cleanup, we go out and we gather everything and we put it all into a pile, and then we sort it so that we can actually collect the data on it. So you can see on the left, there's a pile of unsorted garbage, and then we've divided it up, and we have a lot of bottle caps, a lot of straws. You can see in the pile there's, I don't know if you guys will pick this stuff out right away, but I can see a firecracker, a shingle, a tennis ball, some personal hygiene items, foam. I see a Snickers bar. So it's a real mix of things. These pictures were taken at Colonel Sam Smith Park in Toronto. And so this is another thing we find a lot of. This is at the same location, a lot of personal hygiene items. So a lot of the plastic flossers. The thing in the middle, that's the plastic sticks from like Q-tips. So you can get Q-tips that have a paper stick, and we don't find any of those because they usually disintegrate in the water. But the plastic ones, the little fuzzy bits on the ends comes off, and we're left with the sticks. So we have found a lot of those. Remember, that's all at one beach. And then, of course, tampon applicators. So the reason why we're finding a lot of personal hygiene items like this is because it was probably flushed. And on Lake Ontario, there's a lot of water treatment plants. And when water levels are high and there's a lot of rain or snow melt, a lot of the infrastructure is really old and can't handle the increase in water. So what ends up happening is the treatment plants actually have to do a sewage bypass, which means that everything that's flushed or in the sewers goes straight out into the lake without being treated. They have to do that because if they don't, all the raw sewage will back up into our homes, and that isn't good for anyone. So the next best thing, I suppose, is that it gets dumped into the lake, and they're hoping that it would disperse, which if it was just number 1, number 2, and toilet paper, it would. But anything that's flushed down the toilet, like tampon applicators, Q-tips, condoms, bags of drugs, anything like that, that's all going to end up straight in the lake and then washing up later. So there are areas where we find a whole bunch of stuff like this, which means there was probably a sewage bypass and it all kind of gathered on the shore together afterwards. So it's kind of gross. A lot of people don't know about that, but please do not flush anything down the toilet that is not supposed to go down the toilet. It will definitely help reduce this type of waste ending up on the shore. So this is some of the plastic pieces that I was talking about earlier. So some of the things we can identify, like chapstick, which would go under our hygiene column, a piece of a flower pot, a bottle cap, the seal off a milk carton. But some of the things we don't know what they are, so we just classify them as plastic pieces. They could be from anything. A lot of this stuff has been in the lake for a long time, and the plastic just breaks into smaller and smaller pieces. So it gets harder and harder to identify, and it also contaminates the lake more because as the plastic breaks down, it's harder to collect, and it actually attracts toxins to it. And as it breaks down, it has more surface area, which means that more toxins can be collected on each piece. And in turn, that means that being more toxic, it's more toxic to wildlife as well if they ingest any of this plastic. So not only is it filling their stomachs with plastic instead of nutrients, but it could also be very toxic and harmful to the animal as well. And same goes for foam. We find a lot of foam, and it comes in a lot of different forms. So you can see here there's part of a foam cup, some insulation, and a piece from those 3D puzzles that used to be cool a long time ago. But the rest of it, we're not really sure. Part of it could be like part of a pool noodle, part of a cooler, any kind of packing foam that goes around, like if you buy a new blender or anything like that. We do find a lot of that type of stuff, and as it's in the lake, it breaks up smaller and smaller and gets harder and harder to clean up. And then the last thing I want to show you here is Nurdles. So they're plastic pellets that they're for manufacturing new plastic goods. So a factory will buy Nurdles, they melt them down, and they turn them into new plastic items. So there's a lot of shipping that goes on in Lake Ontario, and these end up falling off shipping containers while they're passing over the lake. So we do find a lot of these, mostly in sandy areas, because they stick to the sand. And they are hard to clean up because you need a sifter and it's time consuming. They're kind of hard to see. You've probably come across them a lot of times, but you just haven't noticed them because they are so small. But this is one of the things that's harder to tackle, because some of the things like, you know, plastic tampon applicators and Q-tips, we can do something about that individually. We can decide that we're gonna have a reusable alternative, or, you know, just stop using that product altogether. There's lots of sustainable options out there to replace the things that are causing harm to the environment. But with things like Nurdles, we don't really have a say in what happens with them. So it's harder to stop this from ending up in the lake, but there definitely are ways to tackle it. So it has to go through a higher power. And the best way to kind of get that going is to make more people aware of them and make more people concerned about this type of hazard, so that we can either create petitions or talk to the right people to make legislature to prevent these from ending up in the lake. So there are ways around it, but it takes time to figure this type of thing out when you can't take direct action as an individual person. So some simple actions that you can take are to use a reusable water bottle and a hot drinking cup. So those are two of the things that I started with, and I have never looked back. So it takes some time to get in the habit of bringing your water bottle or your cup with you. But over the past, I'd say 5 or so years that I have brought my own cup with me, I've probably reduced my own waste by like thousands of cups, because I love drinking tea, and I get tea when I'm out a lot, and now I find places where I can refill my own cup, or I bring my own tea from home. So I don't use paper cups anymore, and same with having a reusable bottle. I don't buy bottled water, I don't buy pop. If I want something other than water, I can bring it from home and I'll just put it in my bottle, and usually it's something like iced tea or lemonade or something like that. But yeah, I've reduced a lot of waste that way, and that was how I just got started. And then once I became more aware and concerned about my own impact, I started saying no to other things and finding reusable options. So saying no to straws is really important. There's lots of alternatives out there, and for most people, you don't even really need a straw. Same with utensils. I bring bamboo utensils around with me so that I don't have to use plastic ones. I have reusable bags for shopping, including produce bags, and same with hygiene items. I'm always looking for alternatives to replace anything plastic that I have. So even for things like floss, you can get bamboo or silk floss that's biodegradable, and you can put it right in the compost when you're done. So for everything out there that has a really negative environmental impact, there's something out there that's sustainable that could be used to replace that item. so the bottom line is becoming a conscious consumer is the best way to reduce plastic. And that's something that definitely takes time. When I first started out, I didn't really realize the impact I was having. And even now, when I look around my house, I still see things that I know there's probably an alternative out there. And when it comes time to replace that item, I'll definitely look into finding the most sustainable option, whether that means buying locally or secondhand, or maybe just going without it. Maybe it's something I didn't need in the first place. So it's a good way to save money and buy things that are higher quality and are going to last and that you're going to appreciate and take care of. So the impact of just doing these few things, for the list of things that we actually have on our data sheet, if we got rid of all the bottles, cups, lids, straws, bags, hygiene items, and utensils that we pick up that are plastic, that would be over 69,000 pieces that would have been missing from the beach. That's 22% less plastic just by reducing those few items. So your individual impact is massive over a lifetime. If you stopped using one item that you use regularly right now, just imagine over the next 20, 40, 60 years, how much that would add up. So I think every action counts, and it's really important to remember that collectively we're going to make a really big impact on the environment in general, but every action matters, and every little bit that you do, it does count, even though it might not feel like it's a big deal, especially when you make it into a new habit and you do it over an extended period of time. So I'm finding with myself, when I look back 5 years, I can't even believe the difference between my lifestyle then and now. And I'm hoping in another 5 or 10 years, I'll be able to look back again and see improvement again. I notice a lot in my health and just my consciousness about, the products I use and what's, better for me and my family. And, I definitely don't use as much stuff as I used to. And I feel really good about it because it took a long time to get to this point, but it's something to be proud of. So I'm going to get to questions now. We'll do a Q&A. So Chelsea, where are you?
Hi.
Hi. Okay, so does anyone have any questions either about Lake Ontario or the plastic or reducing waste or, just in general? There's always so much going on when we go out and do litter cleanups. And sometimes we're pretty shocked by the things we find. And it can be kind of surprising that we find a lot of litter in areas that are a little bit more remote. But I think that's all part of the fun and the experience and the journey. So it's really awesome that we've been keeping track of our data and that we have that to look back on and see all of the stuff that we've picked up.
So we have our first question. It's from Lindsay. She asks, do you know the impacts of microplastics on our drinking water coming from Lake Ontario?
So that is something that's actually still being studied by U of T and also in a lot of other places around the world, but specifically on Lake Ontario, it's being studied at U of T. We don't necessarily know what the consequences are of the microplastics in our drinking water, but we do know that they're there and that there's lots of them. So it's one of those things that it's really hard because we know that it's probably not good for us, even though we don't know the full impact of what that plastic is doing. But the best thing that we can do right now is to keep picking up the plastic and prevent it from ending up in the lake, so that we don't have an even worse concentration of microplastics in the lake for years to come. There's no really easy way to get them out of the lake. So it makes it that much harder, because we can't just do a big scoop in the lake and clean them all out without removing everything else from the lake, because they are so tiny. So while that's an ongoing study, and we do know that there are plastics in the lake, there's nothing quite yet that will determine like how much we are affected by the microplastics in the lake.
Cool. So our next question is, do you have people that then just focus on the littering aspect?
Yeah. So when we do our cleanups, we're focused a lot on the litter and what we pick up. When we first started out, it was all about the litter and the garbage, but then we realized we can't just keep talking about littering, because that's not the only way that stuff ends up on the ground. There's lots of different ways, like whether it's blowing out of a garbage can or animals digging it out, or flooding issues. It can come from a lot of different places. So we were really focused on just litter, but then we've kind of pivoted to look at waste reduction in general, in hopes of preventing all of that litter from ending up on the ground one way or another. So there are still people out there that litter, for sure. And it is frustrating, but I'm hoping that the more we are outside picking up garbage, the more people will see that and hopefully realize that it's not the right thing to do. Although if they're littering, they probably already know that. But yeah, so we do have people, like our volunteers are obviously aware of littering and the problems that it causes. But a lot of times we're preaching to our own choir, because the people that come out and do litter cleanups with us or connect with us online are usually fairly environmentally minded. So I think our best approach is to just be very visible, and hopefully people who do litter start to learn and appreciate the environment and stop littering.
The next question is, what is the government doing about litter or pollution in Lake Ontario?
So the government is definitely, they try, especially when it comes to municipal governments. They focus a lot more on local littering issues as opposed to the federal government. So some communities are definitely more focused than others, especially if you're in the GTA. The city of Toronto does a fairly good job. There are a lot of people in Toronto, so it's something that's really hard to control. But they do have people that are picking up constantly. They do have campaigns that run. Same with the city of Hamilton. They do have a lot of campaigning, and they do have people working on mitigating litter issues, whether that's installing more garbage cans or raising awareness through campaigns. It just depends on the local situation and whether litter is seen as a big issue or not. When it comes to the federal government, I think they would rather leave it to the municipal governments to focus on that, since it is a local issue most of the time. But the federal government did they are banning single-use plastics in 2021. So as long as that still goes ahead, I think that will also have a big impact on litter in general and just all the waste that's ending up in our environment.
Cool. Someone is asking, I'd love to learn more about about how Love Your Lake started and where you are hoping to go with the organization's efforts.
So Love Your Lake started 5 years ago, and so it's 100 litter cleanups, and we always go from Niagara on the Lake all the way to Kingston. we wanted to focus on Lake Ontario because it's an area that has so many people, and it's used for, you know, for recreation for a lot of people, but also for business, and it's just a place that a lot of people call home. So we wanted to be in an area where there was lots of people that would care enough to volunteer, and doing 100 cleanups along the shoreline just felt like a really good fit to do that, because we could bring all the communities together along the shoreline and fight for one general cause. So we're hoping that if we keep doing this for years to come, eventually we won't find any garbage on the ground, which I think it's going to take a while to get there. But just raising awareness and getting people involved and getting people to have an appreciation for the lake and all that the lake does for us is what's most important to us. There's nothing quite as, I guess, there's nothing that really shows you the impact that we're having as when you go out and actually do a litter cleanup. Because when you're picking up that garbage, it usually looks pretty clean when you get there, but when you start looking around and actually picking it up and put it all in a pile, there's always a lot. We haven't been to a location that didn't have garbage. So by being part of that event and actually having the experience, I think it really helps people understand what the problem is. And then they go home being more aware and hopefully decreasing their own garbage and, you know, like either telling others about it or inviting people to come to cleanups, or even just taking action on their own and going out and doing their own cleanup. So I think inspiring people to care about the lake and about their community in general is what our real goal is, because it's so much more than just picking up garbage when you're out at an event. It's you build your community up, you get to socialize and meet like-minded people, and you leave feeling really good about taking part in an event that has helped the environment.
Cool. So Daniel is asking, which habit did you find most difficult to give up or change, and why?
Definitely convenience. So in one of my last jobs before I started A Greener Future, I worked for Fleming College, and I was traveling a lot. So I ate breakfast, lunch, and dinner on the road, which meant that it was a lot of garbage, a lot of takeout. I did try and go to grocery stores, but even with that, there's a lot of packaging. Like I tried to eat healthy and buy like fruits and vegetables and stuff, but some things you just, like granola bars, you just keep them in your car. So the convenience aspect was definitely hardest, but I've started to try and make things on my own. So like whether that's making granola bars or making cookies, banana bread, making that type of stuff at home, and then just cutting it up and having it ready to go, put it in the freezer or fridge, wherever it needs to go, and then it's ready. And if we go on a car trip, we can just pack it up and away we go. But you have to kind of get good at making things, and you have to get all the ingredients. So it takes some prep, and you have to make time for that. But I'm happy that I did, because I feel like we're eating a lot healthier, and I know what all the ingredients are that are going into my food. And we have a lot less garbage, because generally when we are grocery shopping, not right now because of COVID-19, but usually we take our jars to Bulk Barn and refill them. And that way we don't have any packaging. So I think just looking for all the ways that you can reduce waste one thing at a time, and then, you know, bringing that all together, and whether it's learning how to cook from scratch or, you know, finding someone who can. But I think that's one of the biggest and most difficult changes we made, but I'm really glad that we did.
The next question is, does the sewage bypass also affect the E. coli, and why they close beaches?
Yes. So it depends on the location and the amount of sewage that's being discharged. but yes, because when the sewage is actually being bypassed, there's everything's in there. So number one and number two is in there as well. In most circumstances, it will dissipate pretty quickly with all the plants and stuff that are in the lake. And the lake's so big that it will disperse, but it can be concentrated in some areas, especially close to the plant when it first happens. And that's why you do see a lot of beaches closed when there is a lot of rain or flooding, because there are higher E. coli levels because of sewage bypasses, but also because of it's not just because of sewage bypasses. There's other factors that go into E. coli as well.
All right. How do you dispose of the litter you pick up in a cleanup?
So after we sort everything, we try and put everything where it's supposed to go. So cigarette butts go to TerraCycle to be recycled. We try and recycle any cans or bottles that are in good enough condition. Even things like textiles, we'll make sure that everything's clean and that we can drop it off at a textile recycling program. We have one in Oshawa. I think there's one in Newmarket. And there's one somewhere else that I just recently saw. I think it was Whitby. But yeah, so we try and put everything where it's supposed to go. Unfortunately, plastics that are really degraded can't be recycled. A lot of things that don't have a clear recycling symbol stamp on them can't be recycled. So it's tough. We try and keep some of it so that we can use it for educational purposes, or we can make art out of it. But some of it does end up going in the landfill, sadly. For bigger items, we usually leave them on site and we just let the municipality know, and then they come and take care of them. So yeah, we try and put everything where it's supposed to go. We do take the bottles and like the beer bottles and liquor bottles back to the beer store. But yeah, unfortunately, a lot of the plastic that is really degraded, and especially things like straws and personal hygiene items, they all end up going to either the landfill or incineration, depending on where we are.
Do you know if Lake Ontario is the most polluted / littered of the Great Lakes, perhaps because it's the last lake before the ocean?
I would say that, in my personal opinion, would be that Lake Ontario probably has more litter, but maybe not as much pollution, if that makes sense. There have been some really big algae blooms on Lake Erie in the past few years, and that's from high levels of different chemicals, usually fertilizers and stuff, and cleaning products and phosphates that end up in the lake. So that causes an algae bloom, which can be really bad for the health of the lake and all the wildlife and plant life in general. But when it comes to litter, because we have a lot of people, we also have a lot of garbage. So I think that Lake Ontario is probably more polluted, well, more littered with garbage than any other lake. But it actually doesn't take a whole lot of people for garbage to start adding up, because there's a lot of remote islands that have garbage on them too. So just because there's no people doesn't mean that there's no garbage. And in places like even in Lake Superior, about 10 years ago, there was a spill. A whole bunch of shipping containers fell off a cargo ship and dumped billions of Nurdles into Lake Superior. So since then, all those Nurdles have been filtering down through all the Great Lakes and polluting all of them. So all it takes is one accident to create a huge mess.
Do you know the impacts of road salt on Lake Ontario and alternatives to using salt in Toronto?
So road salt is definitely an issue in a lot of places, especially places where there's a lot of traffic. And from the research that I've seen, it's definitely not good for the environment or good for the lake, especially in areas like where there's rivers that are leading into Lake Ontario. One that comes to mind is the Don River, because it's right by the DVP. There's a lot of road salt that goes in there, and it can be very harmful for the wildlife. And then even going into the lake, it's definitely not good. Alternatives, there's sand, but that can have problems as well, just because it piles up a lot more than salt does. It doesn't melt away, and it can cause damage to the environment as well as to the roads. So I'm not sure of any new innovations, but that might be a really good innovation for someone to come up with, is something that is less harmful or not harmful to the environment, that is actually effective. Because while we don't want to destroy the environment, we also don't want car accidents all over the roads. There already are car accidents all over the roads, so we don't want more of those.
How much of the litter that you pick up is recyclable?
I'd say a fairly small amount, just because a lot of it is degraded. So, and a lot of it is things like McDonald's cups and Tim Hortons cups, which aren't recyclable. Something that's interesting is that as we go along the shores of Lake Ontario, each municipality has different rules and regulations on what can and can't be recycled. And that is all related to what they have at their facilities and what they can sell to other companies. So there's some places where Tim Hortons cups were actually recyclable, but that just meant that they either had the technology to separate the plastic from the paper and recycle the paper, or they had a buyer that would take them and go do that process. So the thing is since China has decided not to take a lot of our garbage and recycling anymore, there's a lot of recycling plants that they can't take things that they used to take. So there's going to be a big overhaul in recycling in the next few years. And what the province is hoping is that they can synchronize what will and will not be accepted in recycling across, and that will be across all of the municipalities in Ontario, which will make it a lot easier, because I feel like it's really confusing when we're going from one place to the next and something's recyclable here, but it's not there, and we have to look through all these waste wizards online and try and figure it out. But yeah, sadly, a lot of the stuff that we do pick up isn't recyclable because it is degraded. So really the only way to reduce waste is to try and avoid it altogether whenever possible, because even if something is recyclable, it doesn't mean that it's actually going to get recycled.
Another one from Alicia is, what are some of the biggest obstacles you've come across so far in your journey?
I guess getting people engaged and active and getting them out to come to litter cleanups is probably one of the hardest things. For me, it's easy for me to just go out and do a litter cleanup anytime I want. But if I'm going to host an event where I want a whole bunch of people to show up, it can be really hard because there's so many things competing with, especially in Toronto, with our event. So having people come out to our cleanups is one of the best things, because it really shows how much people care, and you know, we have a lot of fun and we make friends and we have really good conversations. So although it's a big obstacle to try and win people's attention and get them to actually start caring about the environment, it's also one of the biggest wins, because we do get a lot out of it when we're successful.
We have a few more. What are the harmful effects of metals in the lake? Bottle caps, pop cans, etc.
For the most part, they're probably not too harmful. it takes them a long time to degrade. So especially if they end up getting buried in the sand, they're probably going to be there for a very long time. And there's usually not a lot of it. Well, there might be a lot at the bottom of the lake. We're not really sure on that, but there's probably not, when it comes to like pop cans and things that would float up to the surface. They're actually one of the things that we find least often. So I'm hoping that means that a lot of people are actually recycling them. But what it makes me think is that a lot of people are probably using plastic bottles instead of cans. I'm not sure exactly how the metal would affect the wildlife or anything like that. But what comes to mind is like all these like shipwrecks and stuff that are down at the bottom of the lake. I'm not sure if they're having a big impact or a negative, harmful effect, or if they're just becoming habitat for fish and other wildlife that's living down there.
So this one is a question with a story. So Lindsay says, while doing a solo cleanup for Earth Day, it hit me that I was basically moving most of the littered items from one environment to another environment where the waste is more contained but possibly still polluting another environment, aka the landfill. A lot of these items were not designed to be recycled into something new. They are single use and designed for landfill, food wrappers, packaging, that sort of thing. This was a discouraging realization. What are your thoughts on this?
I've had this thought many times. And I've often wondered, like, when we go pick up all this garbage and put it back in the garbage, is it going to end up in the lake again somehow? And I really hope that it's not. And I hope at least by us separating it and recycling what can be recycled, that some of it goes to a place that it might have a benefit. But it is really discouraging. And that is another reason why we wanted to focus on waste reduction in general, because that's really the only way to solve the problem, is to stop producing and using so much single-use stuff. Where I live in Durham, we actually have an incinerator. So we used up all of our landfill space in the Durham region, and we don't have space to put anymore. And I guess the fees for sending waste to the United States kept going up. So Durham didn't want to have to pay those high fees either. So they invested in making an incineration plant. And that's something that a lot of people are against as well. But I did go for a tour of the facility and learned a little bit more about it. And it's one of only 2 incineration plants in Canada that has really good technology that actually has less pollutants coming out of it than a landfill would. So they have huge filters that filter all the garbage that's being burned. And these filter bags, they last about 10 years, and then they're sent to a toxic waste facility in Quebec. But they also turn all that waste to energy. So the plant powers about 10,000 homes in the area. So when I go do a cleanup and I put stuff in my own garbage and it gets picked up and sent to the incinerator, I think it kind of makes me feel like at least that garbage is being turned into energy and that it's actually gone in a sense. But at the same time, I know that that's not the solution. Like, we can't just go burn all of our garbage, especially because in a lot of places around the world, burning garbage is just that, just like setting it on fire in a landfill, basically, and it's not filtered in any way, which is awful for the environment and for our air quality and everything else. But if we can use state-of-the-art technology and reduce the impact on the environment while also powering homes, they also take all of the metals, the metals that fall out of, like, say, mattresses or anything else that is in the garbage, and they sell that back to manufacturers that will use the metal. So in a sense, they are also recycling. But yeah, it's a really tough thing to think about, because obviously not every community has access to an incinerator, and landfills are not the greatest solution when it comes to reducing waste. They fill up, and then what? So it's tough, and I think we really do need to focus on just reducing waste in general in order to get anywhere.
Okay, I think we have two more. How many people and how much time do you think it might take to clean up the whole Lake Ontario shoreline?
So when we do our cleanup each year, we do 100 locations on the Canada side, and we usually have about 500 volunteers. So we definitely don't get all of the garbage, and by the time we're done, we could go back to the beginning and probably do it all over again and pick up just as much. So I think we would need a lot of people, and we would probably all have to go out at once and go all along the shoreline and pick up everything that we see. So I would say like thousands, hundreds of thousands of people all working together for our team of 2 plus interns and volunteers. So sometimes we have 2 people at a cleanup, sometimes we have up to 60. And we generally pick up between 500 and I'd say 5,000 pieces at a litter cleanup. Over the whole spring and summer, we pick up around 100,000 pieces at 100 locations. So that's probably just a small percentage of what's actually on the shoreline, sadly. So it would take a lot of power.
So this is the last one, unless anybody has any more questions. With COVID-19, I think it's been really telling of what we are able to give up as a society when required of us. What is one of the most outrageous ideas you've had lately about what might be possible post-COVID?
I'm hoping that people start to realize that they can go without a lot of the things that they thought were necessary before. I think the whole COVID-19 issue has its ups and downs. It's definitely made things harder in some ways, especially when it comes to shopping and like getting groceries and getting things with less packaging, because we don't have all the options that we had before. So I'm hoping things go back to normal in that sense, but I'm really hoping that people kind of come together and realize what's really important and want to take care of the environment and take care of each other and become better listeners, and realize that being social and being with people in real life is so important. And that's one of the biggest things about doing our Love Your Lake cleanups, is having those people come out to meet us and pick up garbage, and just the conversations we have. And I really miss that, and I hope we can get back to that. And it would be great if we had more volunteers than ever, because it's really nice to get out in that atmosphere. I think at the end of this, people might be a little bit tired of screen time, so hopefully we'll see more people out in nature actually appreciating it and wanting to connect out there.
Okay, that was the last question.
All right, awesome. So I want to thank you all for coming. And if you do have any questions, feel free to send them to me. My email is info@agreenerfuture.ca. You can also find us on Instagram and Facebook. Our handle is at A Greener Future. We're really easy to find. And we do have another event coming up on May the 8th. We're doing a screening of the film called Chelsea, help me out.
Story of Plastic.
Story of Plastic. So it's a new film that just came out, and we have set up a private showing, and Chelsea just put the link to that in our chat here. So we only have a set number of seats. So if you want to see the film, make sure that you actually register. So it's going to be on Friday, May 8th at 7 p.m. And I'm going to finish off this broadcast with the video. that is the trailer for the film. So thank you so much for coming. I am so happy that you all made it out, and I loved all your questions. So we'll connect again soon, and hopefully I'll see some of you at our live screening as well. Okay, so let me get this together here.
Rochelle, it's a bit hard to hear it.
Is it? Okay. Yeah. Okay, hold on one second here.
We're back with an alarming new report that came out this past week on the state of the world's oceans.
32% of plastic packaging ends up littering the environment. 40% is sitting in a landfill somewhere. 14% is incinerated. 14% is recycled. But only 2% is effectively recycled.
Downhill from the prison, downhill from the mall, downhill from the factory farm and the hospital.
It's not reasonable at all that we continue to live like this.
Downhill from the border wall, downhill from everywhere, downhill from all you see. The ocean is downhill from gravity.
About 8 million metric tons go into the ocean every year. That's the equivalent of one city garbage truck dumping a load of plastic into the ocean every minute of every day.
This is the story of plastics. It is fossil fuels finding a new form and finding a new place to flow through the economy.
The surge of attention to plastic pollution is pretty striking.
Do you think about it at all?
I believe we're at a tipping point right now. I've seen more policy change globally in the last 8 months than I've seen in 20 years of my career. Because not only are governments getting pissed off, but companies are recognizing they can't get away with it anymore.
I don't think they can keep on tricking people forever.
Perfect. Well, thanks for coming, everyone. I hope you enjoyed, and I hope to see you at the screening.